Yes, let's focus on Florida State, because Florida State has, of course, had a new defensive coordinator. There's a lot of new stuff at Florida State, but I find with the defensive front in particular, they're really trying to change their identity. That was something that you thought going into the season was going to be a strength for the Florida State program. We all remember watching that Georgia Tech game, Pete Thamel saying, hey, I talked to some scouts. They think FSU is the best front in the country. Nick Saban basically saying the same thing. Massive disappointment on the season. So what happens? You get a new defensive coordinator, you get a new defensive line coach, both from Nebraska, Coach Knight and Coach White, and then you start reshaping the way this thing looks with their new 3-3-5 defense. So a lot of moving parts with FSU. I think it was a necessary move to move past the disappointment of last year and start it up front on the defensive side.
And you see on the graphic here, 2 big pickups in the trenches for them. One on the offensive line with Gunnar Hansen from Vanderbilt, and then defensive end James Williams in Nebraska. But before we even get into those guys, there are a couple big notes when you talk about up front when it comes to Florida State. One of them being Darrell Jackson returning, someone who's been at Maryland, who's been at Miami, had to sit out at Florida State a couple years ago because of his transfer situation. But you're getting him back, a guy who has NFL type ability, was a disappointment this year, one of those disappointments that you mentioned, but comes back and is a really nice piece for the center of that defensive line, as you'd expect him to come back motivated after the disappointing year, trying to get his draft stock back where he feels like it should be. On the other end of the spectrum there, Patrick Payton, veteran defensive end, edge guy, enters the portal. This is a guy from Miami Northwestern, huge historic program down here in Miami, has had a lot of sacks in his career, 16 sacks, 109 tackles, 32 tackles for loss, had 7 sacks back in 2023. So had a really good year, the year they made that run, entered the portal last year. NIL situation, ends up rejoining the team. Seems like he was happy at the time with how things had worked out, but comes back to Florida State. A lot of Florida State fans, just seeing stuff on social media and stuff, said that there was a lack of effort at times this year, but that seemed like an issue across the whole team, I will say. This is a guy now entering the portal who is highly, highly talented. Again, draft stock, not where he wants it to be. So could be a big option for a team out there.
Yeah, I think, again, you go back to the change in philosophy, the change in the system. You have the complete shift to now a 3-3-5 defense. If you look at the areas where FSU was most porous last year, run defense, third down defense. These are strengths of Nebraska last year under Tony White with this 3-3-5. Very deceptive. You don't know where guys are going to line up. You don't know which guys are going to drop into coverage. You don't know where. It's very hard to predict. It's a very fluid system. So he's looking for players with length, players with versatility. And I think one thing that you're seeing just from the initial moves is you're looking for guys with physical toughness to stand up. Now, with Payton, I've watched him since he was in high school. He was a guy that was a safety, 6'5" safety, similar to Greg Rousseau in that way. A lot of comparisons to Greg Rousseau, who went to Miami and is now with the Buffalo Bills, one of the best defensive ends in the nation, in the country, at the NFL level. Payton was comped to him a lot because he was a 6'5" guy, moved down, had a lot of sacks. I think he had like 12-plus sacks, maybe more than that. He led Dade County in sacks as a senior, blew up. FSU was able to get him. He had early success in the ACC as a pass rusher. But the effort against the run this year was, abysmal. It was a big reason why FSU struggled so much in that department. And when one of your players that you're investing a lot of resources in is so apathetic in that part of the game, to me, I'm curious if this was someone that they try to keep or if it's someone they pushed out. And that's something I guess we'll find out as time goes on. Obviously, we'll talk about some of the moves that they've made to fill that edge position with a guy like James Williams, much different profile than Patrick Payton. But clearly they valued Darrell Jackson and what he brings as an interior rusher more than what you get from Payton as a rusher on the outside. And I think that makes sense. It's a lot more rare to get the interior pressure that Darrell Jackson gets, top 10 in the country as far as defensive line pressures, that even with the inconsistency that he can bring, he's just more unique in terms of his tools. And then the edges you're trying to get, and we'll get to with James Williams here in a second, are going to be guys with high motor, length, some size to them, not just the 230 guys, maybe 250, 260 type guys, and that versatility you want up front. So clear that FSU is trying to move past what they had last year on their front while retaining what they thought was working for them, which was Darrell Jackson.
You referenced the guy who might be replacing him here, James Williams, coming over from Nebraska. He's had an interesting journey. Iowa Central Community College, was a walk-on at Nebraska, where he's a 6'6", 250-pound edge who had a lot of production this year, 7 sacks and 7.5 tackles for loss. This is a guy who, just looking at the frame, man, has the NFL length, and coming over with familiarity with defensive coordinator Tony White and defensive line coach Terrence Knighton, who obviously have been a big part of his development.
Yeah, he called Knighton like a father figure to him. So that's just an obvious connection there. We talked about the issues in this past offseason, meaning the offseason before the 24 season, with FSU's defensive line and the NIL negotiations, and then the disappointment that followed on the field. This is sort of, to me, taking a whole different approach where you're saying, all right, this is a former walk-on that went the community college route and really worked his way into being potentially an NFL draft prospect with the arrow pointing up. So the attitude is different. He considers Pot Roast Knighton to be a father figure. He said that. So, you don't want to let down a father figure like that with your effort. He's a high effort player, still raw, but you've seen flashes. Spin move to end the game against Rutgers. Just an unbelievable play on that strip sack. Shows the athleticism. These walk-ons, particularly from that part of the country, it's like Nebraska used to live with guys from Missouri and Iowa and then Nebraska, turning those guys into first-round picks. Guys like that tend to develop a little later. They're tall, they're big, and they learn as they go. So this is someone whose best football may be ahead of him. He's got 2 years of eligibility. But I think more than anything, you're seeing Tony White, Pot Roast Knighton, reshape that defensive front into their identity. This is you mentioned when you were watching his film, Pete, he was dropping back into coverage, right? He was rushing, doing a lot of things that are confusing in this 3-3-5 front.
And he was not the only player that they picked up in the trenches, other side of the ball. But regardless, Gunnar Hansen comes over from Vanderbilt, ton of experience for him, 37 games started in his career. So Florida State's offensive line was one of their biggest issues this season. Although the Florida State fans would tell you they were experienced coming into the season, there's more to it than that. But Hansen, a guy 6'5", 325, played a ton of football for Vanderbilt in the SEC, was named SEC Offensive Lineman of the Week and Outland National Player of the Week this season as well.
Yeah, someone I've watched since he was in high school. I remember seeing him at a camp when he was very much an under-recruited player out of St. Thomas. Big, wide body, good feet. Really turned it on at that camp. Ended up getting the SEC offer from Vanderbilt and going in that direction. But he's certainly a late blooming type of player. Always been a big guy, and athletic. But sometimes those guys take a little bit to all come together. So goes to Vanderbilt, plays his best football this year. SEC Offensive Lineman of the Week after they beat Alabama, like you mentioned, Pete, and somebody who can play at tackle at the SEC level. You probably like him inside just based on his body type, but the arrow's pointing in the right direction. His best season is probably going to be his next season based on his trajectory. Still, again, he was not someone who came into college physically ready to go, but he still played early, and the starts speak for themselves. And those are high-quality SEC starts. So I think this is someone's going to provide an instant upgrade. Again, you talk about 37 starts in the SEC, man. I mean, that experience is invaluable. Usually guys that start that much games are either graduated or they're in the NFL. So to get a guy like that and bring him into the ACC to an offensive line that had his struggles last year, one of the worst in the country, again, kind of like not as talented as a defensive line, but similar disappointment, right, given what you expected before the year. So to add a guy like Hansen who's got a lot to prove, he wants to show that he's an NFL-type player, chip on his shoulder kind of guy. I like the fit. Question with him, is he going to be a guard? Is he going to play tackle like he did at Vanderbilt? They'll sort that all out. But good to have someone who has versatility and who's gone against the best pass rushers in America.